everyone, Chaps here, and we just completed a 2-week vacation through New Zealand covering both the parts of the North Island and parts of the South Island. Most, but not all, of what I'm going to cover here in this video was actually covered in our daily recap videos. If you missed those, they go into a lot more detail, but in this one I'm just going to go briefly through our entire trip so you can get it all condensed in one little place. So we left on February 24th, which was actually the day after Caroline's 30th birthday. So I guess this was kind of a large birthday present for her, almost. And then we landed back in the States on March 11th. So we were gone for quite a while. Of course, we lost a little bit of time due to flights. We left on the 24th and we landed on the 26th. That was crazy. And then on the way back, we left on the 11th and got back to the States on the 11th, which was pretty cool. It's summer in New Zealand at this time. Normally that's like December through late February, early March. So we're hitting it right at the end of the summer and into the fall time frame. I made this crazy spreadsheet just highlighting the weather and like the temperature and rain and all of that stuff about each time of year and what excursions were open each time of year, what hikes we could do when. And that's sort of how we filtered down to this time of year and when we wanted to do it. And I'll say we really lucked out. The weather was absolutely perfect for us the entire time there. There was like one day where it rained a little bit and it delayed something by 20 minutes, but that's no big deal over the course of 2 weeks. And there was a cyclone that went through about 2 weeks prior to us getting there. So we really lucked out that we were not there when the cyclone hit. So for the trip, we flew American Airlines from CVG near Cincinnati, Ohio, to DFW, or Dallas, Texas area, and from there we almost immediately boarded our next flight from DFW to AKL, or the Auckland, New Zealand airport. This is a 15-and-a-half-hour flight, and yeah, it felt that long. It was exhausting. We landed on what I'm calling day 3, February 26th. Funny enough, we never actually had a February 25th, at least not on land due to the time zone changes. So we landed on the 26th at 9 a.m. New Zealand time, which was actually about 3 p.m. on the 25th back home. An easy trick for the time zones was adding 6 hours to our time and then going back one day. This day was meant to be a relaxing day for us to catch up on jet lag, so we didn't really have much planned. We got our rental, got some food, checked into our hotel, and from there basically just walked to a nearby park and mall to relax. Bed was early. We were asleep by 7 p.m., probably even 6:30. The next day, we woke at 4:30 for a long and early drive to scuba diving at Dive Tutukaka. This gave me ample time to adjust to driving on the wrong side of the road and some seemingly strange driving quirks in New Zealand. You can check out the lessons learned video for that one. Being it was so early in the morning, the drive was dark and then turned into fog, so we didn't actually get to see much. Hence me just throwing up the scuba footage this whole time. There's nothing to see on the drive. Scuba was absolutely amazing at the Poor Knights Islands. This was my second time doing scuba and Caroline's first. She enjoyed it, but prefers snorkeling, so we'll likely just do snorkeling in the future. We then drove about 30 minutes to our hotel in Whangarei, and the next day was another free day for us. In case scuba had been cancelled or delayed, we just scheduled this extra free day. We ended up doing a couple of hikes on our way back to Auckland, and then a hike in Auckland itself. First off, the hikes had some amazing views, especially Mount Aubrey. But what was even more impressive was the drive. Remember, it was dark last time we drove, but now it was bright and clear out. You know the almost artificial green rolling hills from the Shire? Well, yeah, that's basically everywhere on the North Island, and it was amazing. We didn't leave too much time to explore each of the towns that we stopped in, but from what I saw so far, I hadn't really been too impressed by the towns. The scenery between towns and hikes and excursions and stuff was awesome, but the towns themselves weren't anything spectacular. Like, it wasn't bad for a normal town, I guess I'll say, but I guess I had higher expectations, being that we were in more of a tourist town. Day 6 started off with what most people are probably thinking of doing in New Zealand. We headed to Matamata to check out Hobbiton, aka the Shire. This was a very hot and sunny walk, but had a nice display of hobbit holes. Personally, I expected a bit more, but Caroline was pleased. And to be clear, I wasn't disappointed, and I'd still recommend it. I just expected a tad bit more. Following Hobbiton, we hopped on the road to Rotorua. We had a couple of hours to relax in the hotel before driving down the road to a Maori village for a cultural experience and feast. The show was quite entertaining, and the food was probably the best that we had on the entire trip. The following day was pretty awesome. We started at Tapuia, checking out another Maori village, as well as some geothermal areas where we got to see various pools and geysers. We had a couple hours to kill, so we picked out a few other geothermal sites in the area to go explore, the highlights being the hot pools at Curacao Park. None of that came close to touching the highlight of the South Island in my opinion though, and that was Zorbing. This was just so much fun, and I can't wait to go again. We are at Zorb Rotorua, and I can't recommend them enough. The day concluded with a drive down to Tarangi in order to prepare for a long hike. Day 8 was dedicated to the Tongariro Alpine crossing, our most anticipated hike for this trip. It was an all-day event starting at 8 a.m. and it was ending close to 4 p.m. The hike was 21 kilometers long for us and offered up some amazing views, including passing right past Mount Doom. And yep, that's right, it only took us 3 days to get from the Shire to Mount Doom, and we had time for some other stops along the way. Those hobbits were really slacking. But seriously, this was an exhausting hike. It was totally worth it, but it was exhausting. If you're planning a trip and want to do this hike, I would certainly plan to take the following day to just recover. And that's kind of what we did. The next day was another free day for us to recover and do whatever we wanted. It was also scheduled as a buffer day in case the weather was poor for the hike on day 8. But the weather was good, so for this buffer day, we opted to drive 2 hours to the Waitomo caves in order to see glowworms. Now, I can't really say that I recommend this. The cave and the worms weren't bad if you're in the area, but it wasn't really worth the 2-hour drive in my opinion. Caroline, on the other hand, who wasn't the one driving, thinks it was probably still worth it. I do think there's some other stuff in the area that wouldn't have required us to drive 2 hours that probably would have been a better choice though. What was totally worth it that day though was the Tawahi Pools, also known as Gollum's Pool. It was a very short hike and gave some great views of a few pools and falls. I mean, I wouldn't go too far out of your way to do it, but if you're in the Tongariro area like we were, I'd certainly make the stop. Day 10 was our transition day, north to South Island. We started by driving to Tekapo. There we walked through the town a bit, which was quite a nice town, and then we made our way to Huka Falls. The main walking path was closed, and we didn't want to double the distance by taking the bike path, so we just opted to drive to the falls. We parked and had a short 10-minute walk down to the falls. This is another one of those things that's worth it if you're in the area, but I don't know if I'd really drive and definitely wouldn't do what we did and add a whole day to your trip just to see this. There was an amazing amount of water flowing through the fall, and the water was this really cool blue color, but it was such a short fall, and there's way better ones around the country. From there, we drove to the Taupo airport for a flight back to Auckland and then to Queenstown. Honestly, this was a mistake, and we should have just driven back to Auckland to catch the flight south. Basically, it was a long wait, a short layover, we almost missed our flight, our bags got lost. Oh, and our hotel wasn't booked properly in Queenstown. For more details on all of that one, just check out the Day 10 video. It was just a bad experience. But hey, we arrived in Queenstown, we got a new rental car, and we checked into a hotel. Day 11 started in Queenstown, and with a trip north, we started the 3-hour drive up to the Mount Cook area. The first thing that dawned on us was that the terrain is very different in the South Island. As soon as we stepped out of our hotel, we saw that we were basically surrounded by what appears to be glacial mountains. The drive was just through a bunch of mountains with very nice views. As we approached, the snow and ice-topped mountains overlooking Lake Pukaki gave some truly spectacular views. There we did the Hooker Valley track and the Key Point track. I'll warn you that the parking lot gets quite full here and you might need to plan on parking alongside the street. The hikes were okay in the area, but a bit underwhelming compared to some of our other ones. That's not to say that the views sucked though. I mean, that entire area had some crazy awesome views. Our next stop was at Lake Tekapo. As we were leaving the Mount Cook area and starting to drive, the clouds had cleared a bit, and those views over Lake Pukaki were again just breathtaking. We probably should have pulled over for some pictures, but we just rolled down the window and slowed down a bit so Caroline could take some pictures out the window. Tekapo was a nice quaint town that has very little noise pollution. This made for the perfect place for stargazing. We lucked out and had almost no clouds at night. There were a few unfortunate aspects though, such as the extremely bright full moon, but you can check out our Day 11 video for some tips on how to avoid some of those unfortunate events. Day 12 was supposed to be a hike of Isthmus Peak on our way back to Queenstown. Unfortunately, starting on Day 5, I started to have a bronchial issue, and it was just getting worse and worse. Because of that, and honestly partially because our legs were exhausted from the previous hikes, we skipped a hike that day for Isthmus Peak and just went straight to Queenstown so I could go visit a doctor. He prescribed a few medications to help my symptoms calm down until we got back to the States. And yeah, that was definitely worth it. It worked out really well. Following that visit to the doctor and checking into the hotel, we walked down to the harbor and walked around a park for a bit. It was a nice, relaxing way to kill some time. Queenstown was probably my favorite town in terms of cleanliness and being able to walk around. I'll say Rotorua was also extremely nice, but Queenstown was probably my favorite. In addition, most of the shops seem to be open, which sounds like a strange thing to say, but most of the towns that we visited so far in the North Island had a ton of closures. For dinner, we stopped at the infamous Ferg Burger, where we had a great experience. The food was fantastic and the price was lower than expected. The day didn't quite go as planned, but I think it turned out to be a pretty solid day. Day 13 was an early morning to catch a 7 a.m. shuttle to Milford Sound. I'll say I really enjoyed this as it was the only day of the trip that I did not have to drive. We booked this trip through Awesome NZ for a coach ride to Milford Sound, a cruise on the Sound, and then the coach ride back. The driver acted as a guide and pointed out various points of interest along the way and gave some fun facts. Our first stop was in Te Anau, which was really just a 30-minute stop for people to use the restroom and stop by any stores in case they needed anything for the trip. From there we had multiple 10 to 15-minute stops on our way to the Milford Sound, arriving by 12:30, and at 1 our cruise started. It was a nice 2-hour cruise going out to the Tasman Sea and back, and basically you're just surrounded by these huge sheer cliffs on either side, mountains and waterfalls, some of which were permanent and some are temporary from the recent rain, which I guess is really common in that area, but we lucked out and had great weather. Around 3 p.m. it was back on the bus and time to head back to Queenstown. Again, there was another brief stop at Te Anau, which is about the halfway point, so that was around 5 p.m., and we got back to Queenstown around 7:30. Devil Burger was for dinner. It was a competitor of Ferg Burger. It was great, but honestly I've got to give the W to Ferg Burger on this one. So lucky enough, the weather was clear on day 14 and we were able to head to Isthmus Peak for the final hike of the trip. I'm really glad we were able to get this one in, being that we had to skip it on that previous day. This was an exhausting 6-hour hike that was basically a steep uphill the entire time and then a steep downhill on the return. As painful and exhausting as it was, the views along the way and at the summit were just absolutely amazing. Like, they were by far my favorite views from the trip and honestly some of the coolest views I've seen in my entire life. There's not much to really add here. It's a hard hike just because it's exhausting and a steep uphill. There's not really climbing and stuff involved, but it's just a hard hike. But it's totally worth it if you're up for the challenge. See the day 14 video and the expectations versus reality video for some more details on that one. Well, here it is. Day 15, our final full day in New Zealand. Though I guess I'll add that the later afternoon and evening were really just flying, so it's not really a full day of fun. And honestly, I'm just going to gloss over most of this day because not too much happened. We had the morning free, so we headed out to try parasailing over the lake in Queenstown, and unfortunately the wind was too strong and they weren't able to go. So instead we just walked around town, had some ice cream, visited some souvenir shops, and not really a super exciting morning. Though we did get to go experience Ferg Burger again before heading to the airport at 1:30. The plane ride was nice, and we took a bus to a nearby hotel to spend the night. But now that we're all rested, it's time for the real journey. We got to the airport around lunchtime and boarded our 13-ish hour flight from Auckland to Dallas, Texas. It's not quite as long as the 15-and-a-half-hour flight from Dallas to Auckland on the way there, but close enough. It was still pretty miserable. I will note that the food was much better this time. Upon arriving in Dallas, we had to head through customs, recheck through security, and then we still had to wait another 5 hours to board. Packing a change of clothes in our backpack for after that long flight was totally worth it. Flight back to CVG was, as expected, rather uneventful, when we were pretty tired. Luckily, the in-laws were available to pick us up and drive us home. We were in no condition to drive. By the time we were back home and in bed, it had been about 34 sleepless hours for us. But alas, the trip was over. We were certainly jet-lagged for a few days after that, but it's back to business as normal. The trip was absolutely amazing. The weather was perfect. The excursions and events we did were fantastic, and the terrain is just some of the coolest I've ever seen. It was really cool, and the variation of terrain was awesome. I'm just so glad that we were able to finally do this trip. And that's the recap. So this recap was the final planned video for this New Zealand recap series. If you want any more details about the events we did or any of the specific days, we do have those daily recaps linked down in the playlist below. There's also some videos about lessons learned and expectations versus reality, and what would we change if we were to do the trip again. Also note that if there's any questions you have about this trip or New Zealand, go ahead and leave them in a comment down below or hit me up on Twitter. And also, I'll note that if there's a topic that warrants another video, I will happily make another video if someone wants something. If you found this helpful or enjoyable, please consider hitting that like button, and go ahead and subscribe so that you can see what we're up to next. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.